Ebrahim Deen is a senior researcher and program officer, Africa and the Gulf at the think tank Afro-Middle East Center, AMEC. He joins us now to speak about this issue. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Ebrahim. I want to hear from you the latest information that you're getting, because according to reports, it says that the Taliban has decided to walk back on its decision and has now decided to reopen high schools as of today for Taliban girls to return.
So there's conflicting views, right? One is the fact that, you have to remember the Taliban is not a monolith, and there's different factions within the group. And so in some areas, schools still remain closed. In some areas, they were already opened last year. But, in saying so, it does seem as if there's this contestation within the group. And at the moment, at least in the head of the grouping, it does seem as if the more conservative element is in the ascendancy. But, in saying so, we also need to note that, Afghanistan society is quite conservative itself. And so, many wouldn't have an issue with, for example, segregated schooling. They may still have an issue, and they are critical of, no schooling.
Okay, so your line dipped a bit. I want to ask you this question. So you're saying obviously they're not monolithic, the Taliban, in terms of the authority over the different areas, but the dominant group, have they walked back on this decision, or are they still not only segregating schools but saying that girls cannot go to high school?
So the news I'm seeing so far is that there hasn't been a change in this position.
Okay.
That they haven't changed the last week's decision. But as I said, on the ground, there are differences, right, depending on the regions. And yes, it's going to affect how they get recognized. I mean, as the report is pointing out, there's an aid conference going on today and tomorrow, trying to raise $4 billion, $4 billion, the largest aid package in a country in the UN. That's likely going to fail because of this decision. So, it does seem as if this pressure will eventually force them to change.
Okay. So many members of the international community expressing surprise, saying this is contrary to the Doha Pact, and this is something that the authorities in Afghanistan had committed to. Do you share this view? Was there ever an explicit promise on this particular point, given the widely known views and professed views of the Taliban at large on this issue? Ebrahim, are you still with us?
I couldn't know why it's so bad.
Okay, we're going to see if we can reconnect with you. Ebrahim Deen just speaking to us about this decision to withdraw some hundreds of millions worth of US dollars in funding for Afghanistan. Ebrahim Deen is a senior researcher and program officer, Africa and the Gulf at the think tank Afro-Middle East Center, AMEC. Mr. Deen, so I was asking, those in the international community who are surprised by this decision, should they be surprised, and are they correct in saying that this is contrary to the Doha Agreement?
So one is, I don't think they should be surprised by the change in stance, because contrary to what they're saying about the Doha Pact, it wasn't really implemented properly. There wasn't proper negotiation. There wasn't a conclusion. And, much of what was in the Doha Pact in relation to, for example, Afghanistan's own funds, the Taliban still don't have that diplomatic relations. So, everyone has acted against the Doha Pact. What though is a surprise is, the belief was that the Taliban as an organization had evolved, and that the younger wing would be a bit more ascendant. And it does seem as if, the younger wing now because of the collapse of the government, the way it collapsed in August, the more diplomatic younger wing seems to have gone down towards the more older wing, which is in the ascendancy now. And so, there is going to be this internal contestation, which probably will take years to solve. And, not necessarily going to be good for both the Taliban and Afghanistan in the sense as a whole.
Now, if these funds that were to be given to Afghanistan on the basis that they were for the advancement and development of the girl child and women as a whole in the areas of education, agriculture and health, how will this impact or affect further discussions on the development of the country as a whole, as you've already mentioned, the fissures within the ruling entities or parties?
And I think the big thing we need to note is that, education is a big issue currently in Afghanistan, but there's bigger issues as well. Currently the economy is in free fall. There's 50 million, 60% of the population, about 24 million, that are, in acute need of food, famine in parts of the country. So, there's those issues, and the funds, much of the funds would have been allocated for issues around that, and much of the donor funds will be allocated for that. But those are going to be suspended, which is going to be a big issue for both Afghanistan and the international community. Now, in relation to schooling and education, I think that there does need to be some sort of negotiations to try and actually get the Taliban to at least change, at least rhetorically, and that doesn't seem to be occurring. But there seems to be disagreement and contrary positions from both the Taliban and the international community, because they haven't yet been recognized. And so how do you then negotiate and force someone to change if you haven't recognized the government? And that's also one of the issues that needs to be talked about and could probably be used as leverage to actually force or institute some change in the governing regime, because it's now 6 months since they've taken over. So they should be able to, or by now they should have been able to, come up with a different dress code or with a segregated form of education if needed be, based on the cultural motivations and cultural aspirations, to actually have education, open to all. Even though, as I said, the conservative nature of Afghan society means many may not necessarily take advantage of such a goal or benefit.
International community is arguing that human rights are inalienable, particularly when you speak about young women or the girl child in Afghanistan. There are those who have argued that Sharia law and Afghan tradition are inextricable from each other. What are your thoughts about this? Does it lay the groundwork for very difficult talks then?
I think the big issue is when we're talking about Sharia law, and it's therefore changes dependent on societies. And there needs to be these internal conversations about reforms within the organization. And that needs to be fostered, probably by clerics more than by governments, and probably clerics from neighboring countries. That's the only way that's going to change those aspects. But, in terms of the financing, there needs to be, the bigger issue is the fact that all the countries, including the governing regime, have remained on agreements. And so we currently have, for example, $9 billion of Afghan funds being frozen in the U.S. It's their own money. Aid donations are not necessarily working as they should have. And so, those issues mean that it's very difficult. And at the end of the day, the people who are suffering at the moment are ordinary Afghans. And, there needs to be some way to actually engage with them at a local level. And suspending such activities aren't necessarily going to help, because as the World Bank says, these funds weren't going to the Taliban, they were going directly to UN agencies that would provide such services. So there has to be ways to localize it and actually bypass the governing regime. And I mean, one being done, there should still be attempts to actually try and ensure that happens. That's probably the only way you can, benefit, the country while still, leaving rooms for negotiations with the ruling regime.
Thank you so much for your time.